does. It does. Exactly. Yeah. Helps get rid of some of the anxiety.
Selma Visitor Center for the Selma Memorial Archives. That was really,
Where's that?
in Selma, Alabama. Yes, it was really the Bronx Zoo. They're doing and there was something more that I can't remember, and then there's still the roads of the long museum. And then on top of everything else, Eric Lambert wants to do a musical institute, and so he's yeah. So I just sent him an email. But Scott was unenthusiastic.
What would the exhibit be on?
I'm looking immediately on research. Eric wants to put a ticker tape on the outside that sequences the biblical sequence.
It's a good idea.
It is a good idea. Oh, he's a real. He knows that?
Yeah.
But I thought
That would be a great project.
Oh, I think so, but I don't know. I think Scott is not into science projects as much as home projects.
Yeah. But somebody is going to bring it up in the end.
Oh, well, Matt Spencer.
He's nature.
That's his official designation. He's nature.
Nature.
He's such a sweet. We've got to find him somebody.
Yeah, we do. I really do. He's really fun. He's really good.
Yeah.
Really fun to hang out with.
He is. He's just a wonderful guy.
I know. You know what I can do? I just found out she was whoever she was dating before. She's from Vermont.
But is she down here?
Yeah, she lives in Boston.
Oh, good.
Yeah, yeah.
And is she an outdoorsy? So
I think so.
I think the criteria are close, outdoorsy, also intellectual. You know, that kind of mix.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I'm gonna get together with her actually this week, Wednesday. And she also has a doctorate in education. She needs history. And she works with a company in Watertown that works with history textbooks, but also but with particular items like cultural history. She's been to China.
Oh, she'd fit right into
Oh,
the circle.
I know.
Let me welcome you to Harvard and to this forum on American domestic policy. This forum is designed to coincide with the interest in matters relating to domestic policy associated with the fact that the Democratic Convention is being held in Boston. But I want to stress at the outset that the views expressed are only the views of the panelists expressing them, and neither should be associated with any presidential candidate, nor in an institutional sense with the Kennedy School or Harvard University. The Institute of Politics has assembled a terrific panel with expertise on some of the key domestic issues facing the country. I'll say a few words about each of them and then invite them to speak and then offer a few observations myself on the economic situation. You have in your programs more lengthy and more formal biographical information about each of our panelists, so I will be brief and less formal. David Ellwood is the dean now for 26 days of the Kennedy School of Government, a professor at the Kennedy School for more than 20 years. It can literally be said that he wrote the book on welfare reform in the United States. His book, Poor Support, proved enormously influential, as he subsequently did in government, in crafting the major changes in welfare policy that were enacted in 1996. Carolyn Hoxby is perhaps the country's leading expert on the economics of education, widely known and admired for her careful empirical work, looking at a variety of different questions, ranging from the impact of admissions policies in higher education to the impact of situations where families have more or less de facto choice in where they live and where their kids go to school on the performance of public schools. Joe Newhouse holds, I believe, the record for being a professor in more different Harvard faculties than any other professor at Harvard. He is a professor at the Kennedy School in Faculty of Arts and Sciences, the Faculty of Public Health, and the Faculty of Medicine. He has done some of the major work on aspects associated with the financing of healthcare, and is perhaps best known for his research looking very carefully in an experimental design at the impact of alternative reimbursement strategies and alternative coinsurance strategies on individuals' utilization of health care. Let's start with Dean Ellwood. David.
We were asked to think about what's the most important question or issue that in our domains that the next president and Congresses really over the next 5 or 10 years are supposed to deal with. And though poverty has been my focus through much of my life, I'd actually like to focus on two very simple ideas, but unbelievably difficult and important challenges. And the simple ideas is that demography is destiny and families are the future. And at the end of World War II, as everyone knows, there was this huge baby boom population that was born, and it was much larger than their parents in size and even larger than the grandparents' generation. And furthermore, they got a lot more education. And finally, women in that group worked outside the home in much larger numbers. And as a result, as that population came and replaced its grandparents and ultimately its parents in the labor force, our workforce grew enormously, and the quality of that workforce, at least as measured by education, increased dramatically. Indeed, the number of native-born 25 to 54-year-old workers grew by 27 million over the last 20 years. It's a growth of well over 40 to 50%. It's a huge increase, and educational attainment went up really quite dramatically. But the children of baby boomers are no more numerous than their parents, and their education is not much more numerous than their parents. And so as our children replace us in the labor force, things will not change. Indeed, the number of native-born 25 to 54-year-old workers will be no different 20 years from now than it is now. Huge increase the last 20 years, nothing in the future. And the average education quality will not change. Now that means that if this economy is going to grow in terms of workers, if it's going to be more productive, the place we will have to look is older workers and immigrants. That's it for new workers. And that's a really profound difference than this native-born population we've tended to rely on in the past. Second of all, that means immigration, those issues are going to be critical. But it also means that there's a real worry about productivity growth. It means that issues of inequality, which grew enormously, by the way, in the last 20 years in spite of a dramatically improving workforce, will likely get much greater. And you start to see the edges of this debate already as you talk about outsourcing and so forth, but it's going to be much larger. But I'd like to focus even more than on that question as to what its origins are, which is that, you remember demography is nothing, it's just a fancy word. It comes from families. It comes from the choices people make about how to form families and whether to have children and when to have children. And there's an unbelievably profound transformation that's happened in the last 20 to 30 years that, again, has profound implications for the future. And it started, ironically, I believe, and this is now in the form of hypotheses and anything else, in the 60s when a series of social changes made economics far more powerful in affecting families and family formation. The social changes were the sexual revolution. Suddenly, good boys and especially good girls were allowed to have sex before marriage and not be seen as immoral in most settings. The technological revolution in birth control, so the pill and other kinds of things, as well as abortion later on. And the revolution in terms of women in the labor force, which I mentioned earlier. More and more women working outside the home and wages going up, and that's not only acceptable, but desirable and alternative. So all of a sudden, women had much greater control over fertility and potentially a reason to do so, another opportunity, work and so forth. And what happened, strikingly, is that high-skilled women have postponed childbearing enormously. Interestingly enough, low-skilled women haven't postponed very much. The high-skilled women have postponed to the point where, if you look at current 40-year-old college-educated women, over a quarter of them have never had a child yet. And the number of children they've had on average is 1.6. And if you looked at the even more educated women, those with more than a college degree, the number of children they've had is more like 1.4. That's way below replacement in that group. Contrast at the bottom end, there has been a decline, but it's still well above replacement, 2.6 children. Often childbearing start quite early in the dropouts and so on. Moreover, marriage patterns have changed during this time as well. Highly educated women are postponing marriage, not as much as childbearing, but they're postponing marriage. But interestingly enough, poorly educated women are also postponing marriage. So what this means is fewer of our children are being born at the top, who are, by the way, among the most advantaged children our nation's ever seen in terms of income, because they have two parents who are typically working and typically having high incomes. And at the bottom, increasingly the children are born in larger numbers even to people that are lone parents and so on. Final question on this score is why? What happened here? What drove it? And I think we go back to the 60s. Why postpone childbearing? Well, the answer is when you look and see what happens to wages of women and their careers. This is the kind of thing, if I talk about at a cocktail party, they say, oh, so they pay you to figure this stuff out, huh? You look at wages for low-skilled women, when they have a child, their wages don't rise very much anyway, and they don't change once they have a child. But as many people know in this room, high-skilled women, their wages are going very rapidly until they have a child, and then they flatten out on average. Of course, it's not uniformly true, but it's a tremendous cost that is being borne, almost principally by women, at the high skill end. And so not surprisingly, perhaps, this is one contributing factor, certainly, for this postponing, in some cases, avoiding childbearing altogether. Marriage, well, it's easy to see why you postpone marriage if you're postponing childbearing, but what happened to marriage at the low end? Well, when you look and say, if you're having a child at 18 or 19 because there's no real point in waiting, what do the men look like at that stage in the current economy? And the answer is they're a disaster. The situation for such men is really bad. So let me just finish up by saying this means that there's really hard questions that come from the demography as destiny and family as the future. And what's really tough about all this, there's only one set of things that's going to come at us and it's going to hit us hard, and that's budgetary questions. There's going to be some budget problems in Social Security and Medicare, and Joe, I'm sure, will talk some about that. But even more important is our productivity, our future, our opportunities, immigration, and so forth. Each one of those we can just ignore. And we'll trundle along. There'll never be a big crisis associated with it and so forth. And yet, if we don't take seriously a very much more thoughtful immigration policy, if we don't ask what is it we can do to make work for low-skilled workers so that they too might have a reason to postpone and to form families and so forth, if we don't think about what it's going to take to make the work-family trade-off less costly to high-skilled women, then we are going to see the patterns we're seeing. And by the way, in parts of Europe, it's far more dramatic than here. These are things that have probably more consequences for our productivity and our economy than anything that's likely to be debated next week or the end of August at the Republican convention or anything else. And again, the difficulty for American democracy is it's not obvious what's the action-forcing event, and yet it has everything to do with our future.
Thank you, David. Carolyn.
Great. I'm going to really pick up on a lot of what David said, and my area is education. So let me first start by saying why I think we have a bit of a crisis in education in the United States, and then why I think we are past the easy answers and on to the tough answers. We are used to being the richest nation on earth, and a lot of that wealth is based on the fact that we are one of the most highly skilled nations on earth. We have a history of promoting universal education that allowed us to become a really highly skilled nation. And in addition, we've benefited a tremendous amount from immigration of people who were highly skilled in their own countries and who wanted to come here so that they could work in a high-skilled industry. And even in the 1990s, we saw a lot of this with the software industry, people coming from developing countries with an engineering degree wanting to work in the software industry here in the US. Well, fundamentally, if we want to remain one of the richest nations on earth and have all of the benefits that are associated with that, that means being able to do what we want to do, educate our children the way we want to educate them, be able to aid other countries, we have to remain highly skilled. And that's because the high-skilled industries in the world are not going to stay in this country unless we produce the skilled people to work in those industries. I think we are now in a world in which industries will not come to the United States just because high-skilled industries have been here in the past. They will go where the high-skilled workers are. You can call this outsourcing, you can call this electronic trade, but the world of trade has opened up in such a way that if you are an employer and you want high-skilled people, you can locate your business where they are. You don't have to locate in the United States. They'll locate here if we have people with skills, but that means that we need an education sector that produces people with skills very reliably. And that we do not have in our public K through 12 sector. I think everyone in this room would agree that public education and elementary and secondary education are important. I really don't think anyone is going to ask me during the question period, don't you really think those things are a bad idea? Everyone thinks they're a good idea. And as a result, Americans have actually invested a lot in K through 12 education over the past 30 years. If you look at our spending on K through 12 education, it has more than doubled since 1970. And if you look at our spending in K through 12 education for disadvantaged kids, poor kids, or kids who have disabilities of one type or another, it has nearly tripled in real terms since 1970. So this is inflation adjusted. At the same time, we have not improved achievement dramatically since 1970. Most of the best indicators we have suggest we're at about the same place we were then. And there are many other countries in the world that have improved their education at the same time that we have more or less held constant. And you can look at a country like Slovenia, which spends less than a sixth of what we spend on a per pupil basis, and they beat us flat on every international test. So this is something we just have to do something about. I think we want to be a high-skilled country in the future, and the only way to do that is to not only make the investments, but also, I think, start making some hard decisions. Traditionally in the United States, our support of education has been broad and we've tried to offer universal education to everyone. And I think that we are going to need to do that again in the future. But I think we have to do something more, and that is require that everyone get a certain level of skills. It's not enough that kids go to school and they stay in school for 12 years or 13 years. They actually need to leave school with the level of skills that will enable them to be the skilled workforce of the future. And if we're going to do that, I think we need to make some tough decisions. We were asked to think about the sorts of decisions that need to be made over the next 5 to 10 years. And I think in public K through 12 education, all of them are hard because all of them will require us to think seriously about some long-term alliances that we've had, political alliances, and also social conventions that we've had. Some of the things that we need to think about are, should we really have testing? And should we have testing for everyone in the United States, or should we just try to get everyone to a minimum level of education? We all know that No Child Left Behind is a very controversial policy in the United States, and that's the sort of thing that's going to have to be revisited, refined, and it's just not going to be easy. I don't think we can walk away from that type of accountability. We have to think about how to do it right. In addition, teachers in the United States are now not very highly paid professionals compared to other professionals, but on the other hand, they're all paid basically the same amount. If we want them to be paid more like other professionals, if we want to attract people from the other professions, we may have to change the way teachers are remunerated in the United States and the way that we think about what a teaching career is. That may really have to change a lot. And that again is a tough thing because we're used to thinking of that career as being the career that our mothers were in, or our aunts, or our grandmothers, and I think it's probably going to have to change as a career. In addition, there are reforms that are being discussed that would particularly benefit kids in the United States who now don't have very much choice of what school they're going to go to. Those are things like charter schools and vouchers and other types of school reform along those lines. I think, again, those pose really difficult questions for us. It's not just a matter of let's send more money to the poor schools of Washington, D.C. or the poor schools of Detroit. It's a question of how can we enable those parents to get what's best for their kids while also ensuring that public schools really do receive support and we don't end up with more segregation, say, than we have today. Hopefully, we could end up with less segregation and better schools. But all of these policies, I think, are tough policies. I think we actually need to pursue all of the courses that I've talked about. I think that what's required is a relatively open mind so that we can think about these controversial policies, but also come up with refined versions that are based on data and expertise, and be willing to break with the past, because I think universal education is not enough for the future.
Joe?
Well, among the list of problems in healthcare, there's a long list, and it's hard to pick one. Healthcare costs are going up much faster than wages. There's no reason to think that's going to stop. We now spend 15% of our gross domestic product in healthcare. That's one set of issues. There's another set of issues around the 16% of the population that at a point in time doesn't have health insurance. A larger proportion won't have health insurance at some point during a year. What to do about that? There's very good evidence that we don't get very good value for the money we spend. Only a little over half the time do people get care that accords with commonly accepted guidelines. And I'm talking about kind of bread and butter care, not cutting edge medicine. And if we have physicians in the audience, they would probably talk about the tort system and malpractice also. But if I think about the issues, particularly in the context of government, and think about them over a 5 to 10 year period, which is the issue today, I think the most important one follows on from David's demography is destiny point, and that is how will we finance Medicare and Social Security as we get out into the 2020s. The reason this is important is that there's no reason to think that the spending increases we've seen in medical care are going to stop. You can ask what's behind that, and what's fundamentally behind that is the march of science. I should mention another policy I think is very important over the long run is policies toward research, particularly the stem cell debate. But as research gets forward, basically medical care has more and more capabilities to do things for people, and they tend on the whole to be expensive. And costs, or one evidence of that, is that our costs really aren't increasing much faster than every other developed country's costs. We spend more at a point in time than everybody else, a lot more, but our rate of increase is about the same. And that reflects the fact that everybody is buying the same kind of advances that we are, maybe not as much as we are, but they're buying it. So if I translate this into government decision-making, Medicare is now 13% of the government budget, 13%, federal government budget. When the prescription drug benefit comes on stream in January of 2006, that'll go to 16%. So 1 out of every 6 federal dollars will be Medicare. This is the true giant sucking sound if you're in the Office of Management and Budget. Because one wants to preserve access for Medicare beneficiaries, it's very hard to limit the Medicare rate of increase to something that's markedly below what's going on in the private sector. Otherwise, physicians and hospitals are not going to be happy when a Medicare patient shows up at their door. Now, it's really hazardous to look through a crystal ball and say what are healthcare costs going to be in the 2020s, but they've gone up at a very steady rate. One can go back to the 1940s, and the rate of increase decade by decade is pretty similar. Now, the Medicare trustees have made, of whom Larry Summers once was one, have made a prediction. They make a prediction every year. And I personally think their prediction is incredibly optimistic. That is, I think they're low. But even if I use their number, they say that by the mid-2020s, we will shift 3 percentage points of our gross domestic product into Medicare, 3 percentage points into Medicare. Probably another 1% or so from Social Security, and then there's the long-term care side of Medicaid. Now, what I think would be more reasonable number than 3% would probably be 5%. All right, what does this mean? The federal budget share of GDP is now around 18%. 18%. So we're talking about if everything else stays constant as a share of GDP, we're going to, and we don't deficit finance, we would have to increase taxes on the order of 1/6 or markedly more, okay, 3% over 18% to finance this. The sooner we get started on this front, the better. Having said all that, the political capital required to address these problems is so enormous that I don't expect either Mr. Kerry or Mr. Bush to take it on in the next term, but they would be doing their successors a favor if they did so. The Medicare increase, however, even in the short run, presents some significant budget problems. Of the increase in all federal spending in 2006 and 2007, Medicare is over half of that increase. That's largely the prescription drug benefit, but it continues to be, it's the second largest domestic program behind Social Security, and it continues to grow faster than federal tax revenue. So both candidates have said they would like to reduce the deficit by a factor of 2 by the time they leave office, trying to cope with the increases. When you come into office and you're looking at trying to potentially cut expenditure, and you're looking at a program that is half of the total increase, and much of that is untouchable because the political pressure will be all to expand the drug benefit, not to cut spending. It's going to be a hard job. Oh, sorry, let me
Thank you.
turn the general economy back to you.
The decision we're going to make over the next decade is whether we're prepared as a country to be serious about government and the things government has to do. Let me say a few words about the context and then a few words about what it means to be serious about government. What happens in this era is going to be determined by how we deal with 3 sets of pressures on the United States. First, the demographic pressures that David described that mean that, roughly speaking, 30 years from now, there will be twice as many people who are retired for every person who's working as there were 20 years ago, and that we'll need to find mechanisms for dealing with that, and that at the same time, we will have substantially more capacity to do things to make those people healthier that someone will have to pay for, which will magnify the economic burden. The second force operating on us is the obligation that will come from being a society that is larger on the world stage than any society has ever been, with the possible exception of ancient Rome. What we do with that is our choice, but many of the choices we may want to make, whether it's doing something about Darfur, spreading democracy, being constructive with respect to global warming, doing things that involve carrots as well as sticks to prevent nuclear proliferation, will involve substantial allocation of our national resources. But whatever, we do not have the option of not mattering, because choices to not pay attention with respect to the world constitute a strategy, and those choices will be profoundly important. The third force operating is what is likely to be wrenching structural change. We are living through the period in history when manufacturing, traditionally thought of as the backbone of economies, is going through a transition very similar to the transition that agriculture went through in the first 75 years of this century. Rapid productivity growth, more rapid than in other sectors of the economy, has meant you can produce more and more stuff that's abundant with fewer and fewer people. Already the fraction of people in the United States working in manufacturing is down to a level close to the level that agriculture reached at about the time of the Second World War. And those trends are only continuing as productivity accelerates. Moreover, there is more scope for trade between countries whose incomes level differ by a factor of 5 or more than there ever has been in the history of the world. In part because income inequality across nations has increased spectacularly over the last century, and in part because the number of things that can be traded has gone way up. Think about all those call centers. All of this has put tremendous pressures and led to widening inequalities in our economy. The top 1% has seen its incomes rise by nearly 200% over the last quarter century. That's about 20 times as fast as the median Americans have seen their incomes rise. And of still greater concern, the evidence is much less clear, but it appears that the correlation between how successful your parents were and how successful you're going to be has gone up, not down. And what that means is that the difference in the life prospects of the children of the fortunate and the children of the less fortunate has probably for the first time in our history risen in the last generation. Dealing with these structural changes, meeting our international obligations, handling the consequences that come from these demographic challenges are staggering issues. They are staggering issues at a time of staggering opportunity because the capacity to increase the productive potential of our economy has never been greater. But our success depends on how we run our government. What are some of the elements? I would highlight three. First, we can't run the government of the greatest society on earth like a struggling LBO, which has fundamentally been the policy of our country at about half the intervals over the last generation. Deferring maintenance, relying on debt finance, counting on optimistic forecasts. This is not the way to meet profound obligations. It presses the question, how long can the world's greatest debtor remain the world's greatest power? Second, we need to, as a society, make the changes in public careers that are necessary to attract the most extraordinary people into careers, both permanent and temporary, in government. Who is going to patrol the 2,000-mile border between the United States and Mexico? Who is going to purchase the $5 billion in equipment that the IRS needs to keep track of rising obligations? Who is going to assess the riskiness of the largest and most complex financial institutions in our country? The answer is people who are going to work for the government, and we all have an enormous stake in those tasks being performed well and creating the kind of society where people who can perform them well go into government, and we are not doing that right now as a country. And the third, I would suggest, is a crisis of, or a question of legitimacy. And it goes to the way our national leaders and the way all of us as citizens think about government. It is right that there are enormous and important debates to be had about whether the voucher system is or is not a good idea, whether the Iraq War was or was not prudent, whether and how prescription drugs should be added to the Medicare program. But I would suggest to you that there are no examples of countries that have, over substantial intervals, achieve their national purposes or the desires of their citizens, whatever those purposes may be, without having been well and competently governed. And therefore, part of respecting your country is respecting its government. And it would be my hope that in the years ahead, that issue of legitimacy will be met as well. Let me ask you, David. You analyzed for us with great richness the changing demography that lies ahead. And you mentioned a number of times the importance of our immigration policy. In broad direction, how would you like to see American immigration policy be different a decade from now than it is today?
I would say a couple things. The first is, I want to start with actually the easiest thing, because I think it's precisely what we're doing that's wrong. If you actually look what our current immigration policy is, and I don't mean what's on the books, I mean what's actually out there, what you see is we have a large-scale immigration of low-skilled workers, often illegal or undocumented immigrants, many of whom end up staying for quite a long time. Every so often we'll have amnesty and other kinds of things. We have another group done through family reunification programs. And then the other major part of our policy is we have a certain number of temporary folks that come in, and our goal is to send them back, in theory. This notion that basically two of the most important groups that are coming in, the very low skill and the very high skill, we are purposely disenfranchising and doing everything we can to make it difficult for them to engage in and connect with our larger society, is about as ahistorical a United States experience as you can imagine. Our goal was, we always said we welcome immigration. Of course, we were always threatened by large numbers, and I'm not in any way suggesting it's always been easy or good. Welcome it and said, put down roots, invest in the society, become a part of things, integrate into the culture, bring your own cultures and add to and provide in whatever ways we can. And ironically, we're almost doing the exact opposite now. We're increasingly relying on workers whom we are discouraging in every way we can from being a part of the larger society. And I think there's real danger here of losing any notion of one America, both because of the well-to-do and less well-to-do, but also in a lot of different other kinds. So I think integration, in the best sense of the word, not loss of culture, but adding to and the richness is part of it. I think there's a second thing. There's been Immigration Commission report after report, and they always say the same things. In addition to family reunification, which is clearly laudable and important, we need to think more, be more systematic and more thoughtful about the kinds of directions the economy's headed and what kinds of folks we ought to add above and beyond family reunification. Instead, there's always a blocking coalition for any kind of strategy that you can come up with. And as a result, because different people have different interests in maintaining some version of the status quo, and as a result, we've never taken seriously this thought about what it is as we as a nation to grow and be productive and so forth do we want to do, and how do we integrate it more fully. So that's a loose answer, but I actually believe there's a third element here that will be unbelievably important, and it's the biggest issue of the day. It's terrorism. And we have enormous fear of immigrants because they could be terrorists. And we only are afraid of the high-skilled immigrants. And so, ironically, at a time when we as a nation and we as a world need more skilled immigrants and more skilled workers, we are saying, let us do everything we can to keep those people out, or if they come in, we'll watch them and send them home immediately after we've trained them. Around this university, we see this extraordinary, it's much, much harder for people from certain countries to get visas and come here and so forth. Larry was just at a lunch. I'm going to quote one of the things that Larry said, if it's all right with him, which was, he said, this new strategy is the best news that's ever been made for the advancement of education in Australia, New Zealand, and other countries. This may be a good thing for the world, but again, this is going to face us with some very direct challenges, because there is legitimate reason for fear, but there's also a critical need that's going to come here. So I think the set of issues around immigration will be a massively important and massively difficult set of ones. And I'm fearful. I mean, our current direction is one that I think is really disturbing. And I don't think either party is taking this on in a serious way.
Caroline, if you had to describe 2 thrusts of change that should be made with respect to No Child Left Behind over the next 5 to 10 years, what would they be?
Well, let me first say the things that I think are good in No Child Left Behind that are worth preserving, and then I'll talk about some of the things that are need some changing. There are 2 things that are good about No Child Left Behind. One is its focus on low-achieving kids, and the other is its sense of urgency. Let me talk about both of those for a second. No Child Left Behind is literally that. It says every child in the United States should achieve proficiency by 2013. And that's a real change from the past, because a lot of states and the federal government would basically say, hey, a school is doing a good job if most kids are doing a good job. But that could mean that year after year, a school could get away with having, say, 20% of their kids, perhaps from disadvantaged families, really never doing very well. And as long as 80% or 70% of them were graduating from high school or perhaps getting some higher education, the school looked really good. I think one of the best things about No Child Left Behind is this focus on every child, that there's no set of kids where we can say, well, it's okay that they're not going to graduate from high school, and it's okay that they can't read, and it's okay that they're illiterate. Every child is supposed to reach a level of proficiency. And there are even standards for kids with disabilities. It's not the same set of standards, but there's an idea that we should get them as well to the level of learning that they are able to attain. So I think that's terrific. I also think the sense of urgency is terrific. No Child Left Behind sets a specific deadline. Whether you like the deadline of 2013 or not is questionable, but it says in finite time, not in the next century, but in finite time. And I think that's a good idea, because other countries are changing, and if we decide that we can do this over the next century instead of doing it over the next 20 years, I think we'll be making a big mistake. In terms of things that need to be changed, there are one set of things that I think need to be changed right away, and that's how schools are graded or held accountable for their student performance. And right now we have a sort of crude system that attempts to reward schools that are they're making progress towards getting all their kids to be proficient. I think the idea of the system is laudable, but I don't think that it actually works very well. And there are a lot of schools that have received bad grades that probably did not deserve to receive bad grades. And that system just needs to be fixed. I don't actually think that it's rocket science to fix it, but I think it requires some people with more knowledge of the data and more knowledge of statistics to go in and produce a system for us that we can really rely on. There's nothing worse than having a system that goes and gives a good school a bad grade and ends up confusing parents and confusing policy, and it really delegitimizes the entire system. The other thing that I think needs to be changed in No Child Left Behind is I'd say it's not realistic about how we're going to get from here to there. There are a couple of ways in which it's unrealistic. If you look at the school choice provisions, it will say, gee, in Washington, D.C., if 10 schools are declared to be failing schools, their kids get to decide to go to other schools. Where are these other schools? Does it mention where these other schools are? Does it say how they're going to arise? What if none of the other schools in Washington, D.C. that are good schools have places? None of this is actually spelled out or even thought out particularly in No Child Left Behind. I think that's because the federal government wanted the states to work it out for themselves. And in fact, only some states have given very much thought to these things. But we basically, I think, need a system of waivers whereby states that have figured out methods of achieving some of the goals are able to get out in front in terms of policy and set examples for other states. And right now, if you're a state and you want to get out in front of No Child Left Behind and you figured out a way to give choice to students, actually you're in violation of No Child Left Behind because it's very strict on what it is that you can do. In addition, there are provisions about qualified teachers in No Child Left Behind, and more or less it's just a mandate. Everyone should be a qualified teacher who's teaching kids in the schools by such and such a date. Doesn't say how we're going to attract people into this profession, which is not that well paid, it's a lot of work, it's not that much fun, and a lot of very highly skilled people leave teaching. And one of the funny things about the United States is that there's something like 12 times as many certified teachers in the United States as there are people teaching. But what that tells us is that there are a lot of people who did teach who stopped teaching, right? And they are now doing something else. And if we want those people to remain as teachers, I think we really just have to change the nature of what a teaching career means. And some reform schools have really done that. They've created systems whereby teachers can be much more rewarded for their students' achievement. They've created career ladders for teachers so that if you're a great teacher, you become a mentor teacher and you're rewarded, but you also become responsible for improving the performance of the teachers under you. It's not just a name mentor teacher, but you're really responsible for being their boss in a way and making sure that they improve student achievement. There are alternative certification mechanisms for getting people into teaching who have been in other careers and have decided, they're in their 50s or something else that they'd like to try teaching. Right now, that's very difficult to do, and No Child Left Behind actually makes it probably harder to do rather than easier. So there are a lot of things that need to be changed in the legislation, and I tend to think that most of the goals of the legislation, if you read them, you'd say, geez, this is a great idea. I think implementation is still a bit on the sketchy side, and we can improve a lot on it.
Joe, we're going to make this the last question, and then I want to throw it open to the audience where I know there'll be a lot of good questions. If managed care and managed competition were, for better or for worse, the ideas of the 1990s in the design of the healthcare system, what's the ideas going to be for the next decade?
I don't think there's any comparable big idea out there now. To the degree there are kind of new directions, I'd point to two, which are somewhat interrelated. One is a response to the deficiencies we've seen in the healthcare system, that people don't get as good quality care. And one of the reasons people point to for that is that a healthcare provider may actually lose money by providing better quality care. How could that happen? We're used to, if you build a better mousetrap, the world beats a path to your door. Well, what might be called the defect at General Electric is called an error or a misadventure in the healthcare system. And this may precipitate that somebody who was in the hospital has to go back to the hospital to get things fixed up. The hospital may get paid for another readmission. If it eliminates the error, it loses that money. Ditto on the physician side. So the main idea is, let's figure out a way to pay for health care that actually rewards quality. There are, by the way, very analogous issues in education. How do we pay so that for better elementary and secondary education? There's some kind of attempts at this going on. I think there'll be more attempts over the next few years, and we'll have to see how it goes. I think this will go in the right direction. I don't think it's a silver bullet. The other issue or big idea on quality, it was press conference in Washington last week on this point, is the greater adoption of information technology in the healthcare system. Healthcare systems invest something like 1% to 2% of its total revenue in IT, which is well below most other sectors. The holy grail is kind of the electronic medical record, so that if you are hit by a car on the street and you get hauled off in an ambulance to the emergency room, they could find out by querying your card, your swipe card, or whatever, exactly what was going on in your medical history. This isn't going to happen over the next 5 years or so, but there's no doubt that we'll be making more use of IT in healthcare, and that should help a lot on the quality side. Both of those things should go in the direction of getting more value out of healthcare for the money we spend. I don't think they'll have major effects on what we spend, however.
Thanks very much, Joe. The floor is open. There are microphones here and there and there. Let me note that the microphones are open for questions, which are defined by Webster's as brief statements that end in question marks. And let me, so that we can hear as many people as possible, encourage our panelists to give brief answers.
Thank you. My question's for Dr. Hoxby. I was just wondering, what is the need for No Child Left Behind or a No Child Left Behind type system when, at least in my own experience, I've seen high schools that simply implement a basic track-based curriculum system, college prep, vocational prep, remedial, and so on, can produce an extraordinary degree of results. At my high school, I got both a good vocational program and actually a very good college prep program. And I'm not sure why programs like this can't simply be implemented instead of a program which is unfunded on a federal level, emphasizes teaching to a test, and doesn't emphasize improving oneself through the levels based on merit as a good level-based system does.
Right.
Thanks.
I think that's just a great question. I think not every school is, unfortunately, not every school is like your school. There are a lot of kids in the United States who tragically really do not know how to read or write or do arithmetic by the time they graduate from high school. And and that is a huge problem for the future. I mean, you just cannot be a person in the United States as an adult and function easily with that level of numeracy and literacy. And I think it's a tragedy that that kids exist like that. But there are schools I've walked into that are just total chaos, and no one is learning anything. And I think the emphasis of No Child Left Behind is not on schools like your school. Really, it's not. There are a lot of schools in the United States that are fine. And frankly, the federal government should leave them alone. The parents and the community are pretty good at monitoring what's happening in those schools, and that's okay. The emphasis on No Child Left Behind is really to try and get kids who are failing up to proficiency, and therefore that is the emphasis of the legislation, and to target schools where large numbers of kids are failing. And some people don't like this emphasis in No Child Left Behind. Some of them think, it's bad that the federal government is not monitoring the achievement of high achievers. On the whole, though, I think the federal government and the states can't monitor everything, so I think they're actually better off on focusing on the relatively few schools where there are dramatically disappointing results. And in those schools, I would agree with you that tests are not everything, and that they should monitor many more outcomes than just tests. But if you literally cannot read and you cannot recognize your numbers, that's not a bad thing to test. So it's just that many of us are above that level, so we look at these tests and we say this is way too basic. But it's not a bad tool for finding out which schools really need our attention.
Thank you, ma'am.
It strikes me, in terms of the three areas of expertise of our three panelists, that we know an awful lot about bad educational or healthcare outcomes, but I'd like David to help us understand what Congress ought to do about the Welfare Reform Act of 1996, which it doesn't seem to know how to rewrite or extend. We certainly know very little about what happened to many of the people that have been pushed off of welfare as a result of the 1996 Act. I'd appreciate it if David would help me understand this situation.
Welfare reform.
Well, I'm for it. I basically think that by all, many of us were who are involved in a lot of the good aspects of welfare reform, making work pay, and so forth, were nervous about the particular form of welfare reform that was passed. I think any fair reading of the evidence is this turned out better than many of us expected. That doesn't mean it's perfect, doesn't mean it hasn't been some problems. My general view is we ought to, I don't like some of the changes that are being proposed in terms of, there are some absurd work requirements and the like being talked about, but I think we ought to extend it and move on. I frankly think what's going on with families, what's going on with wages, is far more important than what's going on in the welfare system, which is not to say I don't care about it. Those of you who know my work know it's my life's work. But it is to say that I think these issues about really figuring out ways to help less skilled workers get ahead, to educate children from these increasingly disadvantaged families and so forth, really ought to be our focus. So my short answer is let's make some modest changes, move forward, and move on to the next set of issues.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I'd like to say I'm honored to be at this institution. I'm from Wisconsin, and I'm a recent graduate from the engineering curriculum there. And my question to the panel is that right now I'm looking for a career in the manufacturing sector, and every indication that I have been looking into, from the New York Times recently 3 weeks ago having a cover story about the impact of the Chinese economy and its relationship with the U.S. economy. And my question is, with 1.5 billion Chinese people and a mass migration of Chinese from the rural community into the cities in order to be working in these plants which are set up by international corporations, what will be the relationship of the U.S. economy with the Chinese economy, and how will that impact recent graduates in the engineering curriculum as myself for the future?
There's no question that nothing is certain, and there's a lot that can happen in China. But on the projections that seem most plausible right now, China, India, a number of countries where average incomes are far lower than in the United States, will be a substantially larger part of the global economy than they have been historically. And that will be associated with changes of two kinds for the United States. They will be both our competitor and our customer. As our customer, they will create tremendous opportunities for producers of U.S. products. As our competitor, they will put pressure on U.S. firms that are engaged in production, and they will reduce the cost of things that we buy. It's very hard to know what the impact will be on your engineering career. On the one hand, you will face competition from the fact that certain tasks you could have performed will be otherwise performed in China at a lower wage than you would expect. On the other hand, there will be all sorts of opportunities opened up by the fact that information technology equipment will be available in the United States at a significantly lower cost than it would have been without the Chinese market. And so there will be a set of changes that will come. But I do think that the popular perception does somewhat exaggerate the importance of the international factor relative to the general churning in our economy. Every year in America, 20 million jobs are, something like 20 million jobs are eliminated and 20 million jobs are created. And that's just a huge number relative to any of the figures on outsourcing. And so I think we all are going to have to be better prepared to be more flexible through our lives than historically, but there are very, very strong opportunity elements as well in what's happening in China.
My question is with respect to college access, specifically institutional access. And that is, what role does the federal government have, if any, in supporting college admissions reform? And if it does, specifically, what should it be doing with respect to class-based affirmative action, as former Princeton President William Bowen has called for, in addition to race-based affirmative action, binding early decision policies, which Harvard University does not practice, but a couple hundred other schools do. And then third, legacy preferences, which Harvard University does practice.
I guess that question's for me. I think the federal government has to be very, very, very careful about trying to mandate any kind of admissions policy for private institutions. Harvard University practices race-based admissions, as do most other leading private universities, and we defended successfully, vigorously, our right to do that. Those policies were not mandated on us. An important aspect of our academic freedom is our ability to compose a class that we think best achieves our educational objectives. I think that we do all need to do more to attract and recruit and assure fair treatment of students from disadvantaged backgrounds, whatever their race. And as you probably know, Harvard's taken a variety of steps in that regard, including eliminating the parental contribution for families with incomes under $40,000. I personally have grave concerns on fairness grounds with the practice of early decision. It seems to me that it is for good reason that our placement offices do not permit the practice of exploding offers made by various firms that, you can get such and such an offer, but only if you promise now before you've heard from your other offers. And it seems to me highly problematic when institutions try to subvert that principle in order to attract certain students, and that's something Harvard has never done. Legacy preferences are a very complicated issue. I would only say to you that they are integral to what a private institution is all about. And that institutions like Harvard could not exist without a sense of continuing commitment of families to them. And I would also say to you that if one looks carefully at the data, one finds that legacy students at Harvard, and something similar would be true at other selective institutions, are of, on average, almost precisely the same academic quality as all of the students who are admitted.
Thanks. There are certainly many factors external to schools that affect student achievement, and it seems that one of those factors that schools do have control over but seem to be silent about, and I think also No Child Left Behind is silent about, is nutrition. I'm wondering if you have any commentary on that situation, and especially on the discrepancy between the meals that students may eat, especially coming from lower economic backgrounds, compared to those who do not.
I think that's a terrific point. Let me first start by reinforcing something you said at the beginning of your comment, and that is that schools don't have control of many things that affect student achievement. And you are absolutely right that families are the main determinant of students' achievement. There's no amount of what happens in those 5.5 or 6 hours of school that can make up for all of the other hours that happen at home. And schools are faced with a tough job in many cases because they're trying to do a lot in the short number of hours. I think of school nutrition as being one of those policies that is what I would describe as low-hanging fruit that we just have not really picked up on. We have very few evaluations of improved school nutrition programs. We also have very few evaluations of improved school health programs where there's better monitoring by a school nurse or better sight exams. We know that there are a lot of kids with visual impairments in US schools that go undiagnosed. And the research really just has not been focused on this set of policy issues. I think in part because there's so in the policy debate in schools, there really has not been a group that represents school nutrition, school health in the debate. They're not represented by, say, the teachers' unions. They're not represented typically by the administration. It's not clear that there is an obvious advocacy group that's out there. And to the extent that there's any advocacy for school nutrition, it's really been the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is trying to make sure that surplus, butter gets used. So I think this is a great idea. I don't think that I could say on the basis of research that I know the cost-benefit analysis for school nutrition because I don't think there's enough research out there. But I think that we should do more research on it. And I will also say something to you that I think is true of successful schools. You go to a successful inner-city school or a successful poor school in a poor rural area, and they've just taken it upon themselves to figure out the student nutrition puzzle. They are providing breakfast, they are providing better lunches than they need to provide, and they are usually providing some type of afternoon snack, and they just think it's the right way to spend their dollars. So if I see successful principals doing this who I think are terrific and really know what their kids need, then that makes me think that it's probably a good idea. But it's that sort of anecdotal evidence that I'm going on.
Let me jump in here too, because most people think of school nutrition and they think of kids coming underfed. In fact, we have an epidemic of both childhood and adult obesity in this country. And it relates in part to how schools are financed. Some schools are financed by proceeds on vending machines of soft drinks, big increase there. Some of it reflects, as Carolyn said, surplus commodities that add calories, and some of it reflects the decline probably in physical education, or at least in exercise that kids get, since we know weight equals as a function of calories in and calories expended. But it's a serious health problem. Children that are obese tend to be obese as adults. Obesity predisposes for all sorts of risk factors, including diabetes. This is going to add to our healthcare spending going downstream.
There are states that are doing stuff on this, and Texas, for instance, has recently banned all kinds of vending machines in schools, especially for little kids, and they've also prescribed a menu that contains a lot more fruits and vegetables, and these are the sorts of things that we probably need to evaluate over the next few years to see how well they work. But the states are thinking about it, I think, quite actively.
Let me just add one quick thing, very quick. I think there's one larger point. Successful kids often come from more successful parents. And I think a lot of what we can do in terms of poverty and so forth is we're gonna need all the workers much more than we did in the past as for our economy. And so strategies that are, industry-based training and other kinds of strategies that really do start to help welfare mothers and others move up the ladder. The challenge in welfare reform and poverty and everything else is not getting people into the job, it turns out, is getting them into a job that leads to another job and leads to another job. And so ultimately, I think more successful parents will lead to some of the things in schools that will give us more opportunities as well.
Last question.
Thank you very much. Matt Schaefer from Seattle. The question about how do you balance the budget? It's in the trillions of dollars. There's a great risk that the third world will end up pulling America down rather than having America lift up the rest of the third world in this century. We've got a war on terrorism that's going to cost a lot of money for a long time, the need for health care that is going to cost a lot of money over a long time, as you've been saying. And the deficit has gotten so big that I'm having a hard time even understanding it. So with all of these pressing concerns and this great conflict over whether the U.S. can really serve as a way to lift up the rest of the world. How does one even begin to think about balancing the budget? How important is it? How long would it take?
The first rule of holes is when you're in one, stop digging. And that means avoiding measures that exacerbate the deficit problem. And we haven't had a very good record at doing that, whether on the tax side especially, or on the spending, or on some parts of the spending side over the last couple of years. Second, you balance a budget the way we did it in the 1990s, like you peel an onion, layer by layer, with plenty of tears. And it's a matter of looking at a large number of issues. I actually think that there are probably 4 major pieces to an approach to healthy fiscal policy. One is having a strong economy on other grounds, because that ultimately has an impact on tax revenues, and various kinds of transfer payments go down, unemployment insurance, for example, when you have a healthy economy. And until we have a healthy economy, we're probably not going to balance the budget, and it's actually probably okay when we don't have a healthy economy not to have a balanced budget. Second, we've got to look at the tax cuts that have been legislated and their overall magnitude. And I think it's very difficult to understand the rationale for tax cuts whose size grows precipitously as the moment when the retirement age population, baby boom generation retires. As that moment approaches, the tax cuts get vastly bigger. I think it's actually hard to understand a logic for that kind of outcome. Third, we need to look very hard at Medicare and Social Security, and there's substantial room for the redesign of those programs that probably would be justified even if there weren't budget issues, and is even more justified in the presence of budget issues. And fourth, we have to be attentive on spending issues, and particularly we have to be attentive in the appropriations process, where there is an enormous amount that there is a very limited number of people who care about the building of a certain bridge in a certain place, who care positively. There's nobody who cares negatively about building that bridge. And so we need to go back to the various kinds of institutional measures, Graham-Rudman type measures, budget resolution type measures that provide that constituency for discipline. Frankly, most of the problems we've talked about are extraordinarily hard intellectually as well as politically. The task of returning the nation's fisc to reasonable order is formidable politically, but does not actually involve the kind of profound conceptual difficulty that's involved in thinking through what a healthcare system means. It just requires recognizing that we're all in it together and doing the right things. Thank you all very, very much for being here, and thank you to the panelists.